Hey everybody, welcome to the first video in my FNA game engine video series. In this series, we're going to be making a full 2D game engine using the FNA code library, and the engine that we make will be very flexible. You'll be able to make almost any type of 2D game you can imagine. I've used this engine that we're going to write for both of my titles, Pillar and The Path of Motus. And after we finish writing the engine, we'll also make a small 2D Pong clone to show you how to make a game using the engine as well. But before we jump into setting up our blank FNA project, I'd like to give a quick history lesson about FNA and why it exists. Around 10 years ago, there was a library of code called the Microsoft FNA Game Studio. And this library was obviously created by Microsoft, and the goal of it was to let small development teams of maybe 2 or 3 or hobbyist game programmers create games for the PC and Xbox 360 at the same time. So the code that you write in FNA would just automatically work for Xbox 360 and PC for the most part. It did all of the heavy lifting for you. And this was a very popular code base. A lot of people used it. It became very popular in the independent game community. A lot of small developers have used it. If you played games like Fez, or over here we have Towerfall Ascension, that's a big one, Owlboy, Adventures of Shuggy, Dwarf Corp, I haven't actually played that one, but a ton of games were written based on the FNA framework. And as the years went on, Microsoft eventually quit supporting FNA. They basically said, hey, as we move forward and we release the Xbox One and the new versions of Windows, all you people using FNA will have to move on to something else. We are no longer supporting FNA. And it was really, really sad. I was kind of screwed over at the time because I was working on my game Pillar, and I had no way to actually bring it to Xbox One because all of my code that I was using was no longer supported for future platforms. Okay, and a lot of developers were in this situation of, they were in the middle of game development and they were kind of screwed. But luckily, a group of developers came together and they worked on an open source recreation of FNA called MonoGame. And MonoGame basically let FNA developers reuse all of the code that they had written, and with very minimal code changes, they could run their games on other platforms such as iOS, Android, Xbox One, so on and so forth. So that kind of saved the FNA community. Well, actually, not kind of. It did save the FNA community. It didn't completely screw all of us over. And one guy named Ethan Lee, he started working on a branch of MonoGame, a different version of MonoGame, called MonoGame SDL2. And he had some different goals for his version of MonoGame. He wanted to make a version of MonoGame that focused solely on FNA accuracy and good performance for desktop platforms. A lot of times I feel like how the MonoGame community kind of works is, hey, let's take the core version of MonoGame, create a new version that works for this new platform, and the goal is we just want to get up and running as quick as possible. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I think Ethan had some different goals here with his branch. And eventually, MonoGame SDL2 became FNA, and it, like I said, it is solely for desktop platforms such as PC, Mac, and Linux. It has better performance for these platforms and better accuracy when it comes to preserving FNA4 code. Usually I recommend that if you're wanting to target desktop platforms, you use FNA for 2D games. If you're wanting to target other consoles such as Xbox One, PlayStation 4, PS Vita, Nintendo Switch, so on and so forth, then you would want to use MonoGame. Some people have said to me, why are you using FNA and not MonoGame? And this is why, right? I'm not saying FNA is better than MonoGame or MonoGame is better than FNA. I think they both have strengths in certain areas. And I think FNA's strength is for desktop platforms, and I use MonoGame for the console versions of my games. I use both of them, okay? I'm not taking sides on this. Both people, Ethan Lee and the team behind MonoGame, like Tom Spillman, very intelligent people, better programmers than me, have nothing but respect for both of these projects, okay? So let's go ahead and download the stuff that we need for FNA. I'm at the main page right here. Here's the link, fna-xna.github.io. And here we're going to click download. Let's go ahead and download the latest version of FNA. As of recording this video, The latest version for me is 17.12, but whatever is the newest, go ahead and click and download. Alright. After you've downloaded that and moved it to your desktop, over here we have some more information about the native libraries that FNA needs to run. Let's go ahead and click Visit the FNA Wiki. And right here, Ethan has provided a handy-dandy link. He has precompiled all of the libraries that FNA needs to run. And basically, if you're not too programmer savvy, I have different skill levels of people watching this. FNA takes other libraries to load graphics, to load different types of audio, to play audio. It is dependent on different people's code. So he has provided those people's code right here for us to download. Let's go ahead and do that. And last but not least, to open up this file, the tar.bz2, we will need to download a program called 7-zip. If you go to the link here, you can get to the download page. So I'm running a 64-bit version of Windows. So I downloaded this one right here. Download whatever is appropriate for you. And once you've installed 7-zip, you'll be ready to extract the files we just downloaded. So I'm going to go to my desktop here, and let's first extract the weird BZ tar thing, okay? Once you've installed 7-zip, you can right-click it, and there's a new 7-zip menu right here. We're going to click Extract to fnalibs.tar. It's going to do some work. Inside the fnalibs.tar, we can right-click the tar file and say 7-zip extract to fnalibs. And this folder right here is what we need. Inside of it, he has the different libraries for the different versions you could be targeting. So OS X is the Mac libraries that's needed for FNA to run. But what we'll be needing here are the x64 or x86 libraries, because these are the DLL files for Windows versions of FNA, okay? If you don't know if you're running x64 or x86, you can click the Start menu, right-click on Computer, go to Properties, and down here where it says System Type, it'll tell you either 64 or whatever else you're running, okay? Mine says 64, so that's what I need, x64. Next, let's go ahead and unzip the FNA folder here. I'm going to say Extract All, Extract. And in here we have the FNA library project. There are two different things we could do at this point. We could build the FNA project and get the DLL file, which is basically the one file that has all of the code that Ethan has written. So that will give us access to all of the functions in FNA that our game can use. Or we could make a new game project and just include this entire project in our solution. So our Visual Studio solution would have our game project and the FNA project. If you're an experienced developer, I would recommend that you include the project. But if you're a beginner and you came from my Intro to Programming in C# series, we're going to just build the DLL file, because I feel like as beginners, we don't need to be seeing all this underlying code. So I'm going to right-click this FNA solution right here. I'm going to say Open with Visual Studio 2017. And I'm assuming everyone has Visual Studio installed. If not, there's a free version of it called Visual Studio Community that you can download for free. Alright, it's going to ask if we trust this project. Yes, we do. Hit OK. Alright, and here's the FNA class project. Because this is a class library, if we would hit the Start button here, it would build it, but it wouldn't run it because you can't run a library, okay? But let's go ahead and change this to release, because this is the release version, the final version we want to use. And let's hit build solution. It says build succeeded. If we minimize Visual Studio and go to the FNA folder we are just at, there should now be a bin folder, and then inside of release we have the final product, the fna.dll. So at this point we have all of the DLL files that we need to set up our blank FNA project. Now we need to actually create a new C# project. We'll make it an empty project and then include all these DLLs so we have access to all of the stuff in FNA. So FNA has the methods for us to draw graphics, load graphics, play audio, all the typical game things we need to do, we will need access to in our game. So let's go back to Visual Studio. I'm going to go to File, New, Project, and most likely you have this Visual C# option highlighted under Templates. We need to make sure that under the drop-down menu here, you have highlighted Windows Classic Desktop, and we're going to make an empty .NET project. I'm going to name the project Game Engine, because that's what it is. And then I'll hit OK. So now our new project has been created. We need to copy over those DLL files into this new project directory. So I'm going to right-click my Start menu and go to Open Windows Explorer. And in Documents, we'll go to Visual Studio 2017 and then to Projects. And this is where Visual Studio automatically saves all of the projects you create. So here's our Game Engine project right here. I'm going to go into Game Engine, and then right here in this part of the folder, I'm going to copy fna.dll, paste it, and then I'm going to also copy that entire FNA libs folder here, right next to the FNA DLL. So we have all these files located in an easy, accessible place. Now we need to tell Visual Studio that we are referencing and using these DLLs. So in the description for this video, you should find a download for the Michael Hicks toolkit. And inside this Michael Hicks toolkit, or toolbox, sorry, I've included everything that we'll need in this video series. So there's some art that we'll use, some audio, and right here there's some code that we'll use. If you go into the code folder, you'll find a few text documents right here, and one of them is a post-build event. And in Visual Studio, you can program events that run after your game has built and starts running. And what we want to do is we want to copy all of those DLL files that FNA needs. We want to copy that right next to our executable file, because FNA needs to access those to run. So let's hit Control-A, Control-C, and let's go back to Visual Studio, Game Engine. And now we can right-click Game Engine and go to Properties. And here, there's a few things we need to change. First, in the Application tab, we need to change the output type of this to be a Windows application. A console application would give us a black box that only has text, and we want to have a full-on Windows application that does audio, 2D graphics, the whole shebang, okay? Over here in the target framework, we need to change the .NET framework to be .NET Framework 4 Client Profile. It's going to ask us if we really want to do that. I'm going to say yes, and it will reload everything. And basically the .NET framework is another library of code that's automatically included with C# stuff. And it's basically helper functions, like I believe the lists that we use in C# are in the .NET framework. It's basically a bunch of helper functions to help us. But for FNA to start properly, we need to set this to the Client Profile 4 and refresh it to make everything set correctly. I believe that you can actually, if you would like to use the later .NET frameworks, you can actually set this to whatever you want after you refresh it as the Client 4 profile. But if you don't do this, I ran into some errors earlier where FNA gets confused and it doesn't start the project properly, okay? So once we've done that, we'll go to the Build Events tab. And here we have the pre-build event command line and the post-build event command line. Anything we put in the pre-build event command line will be ran right before we build the game, and the post-build is for after we build the game. So let's go ahead and press Control-V, and this will paste the line that we copied earlier. Make sure that this right here, x64, make sure this is the correct folder of those libraries that we're using. If you're using x86, you'll want to change that, but most people I assume are x64. And this, like I said, will copy all of the DLLs in that x64 FNA libs folder right next to our final exe in the bin folder. let's go ahead and hit Save All up here at the top. And we can exit out of this. We've copied all of those DLLs that FNA needs, but now we need to tell Visual Studio that, hey, we're wanting to use all of the FNA project in our game engine. So here we have this references drop-down menu thing here. See it? We're going to right-click References, click Add Reference, and then down here we will click Browse. And you will need to navigate to, here I'll read, it automatically put me to where I need to be, but I assume most people it won't do that. So you'll need to go to your My Documents, and then again it's Visual Studio 2017, Projects, Game Engine, Game Engine. And right here is the FNA DLL that you need to include. Click it and hit Add, and then finally hit OK. Alright. We have included all of the FNA stuff that we need to include, and our game now just needs to start. Okay, we have all of our references included, but our game has no way to start. So we'll need to create two new classes. The first class we'll create will be called game1.cs, and this will be the central hub for our game where everything will load and update and draw to the screen. It will basically manage our entire game. The second class we need to create will be called program.cs, and we will only use this one time. And think of program.cs as putting the keys in the ignition and starting the car. Okay? We will only use this one time to start up our game and launch the game window. So let's go ahead and start by adding the program.cs class. You can right-click Game Engine, go to Add, and then Class. And then here I'm going to call the class, like I said, program.cs, and hit Add. Now here we can go back to the Michael Hicks toolbox, and here I have a program class ready for you to copy and paste. So you can hit Control-A, Control-C, and then return to program.cs, and here we'll highlight the program class stub that Visual Studio has started and replace it by hitting Control-V to paste the program class that I have provided. And see here, basically this function will be automatically called by FNA, and it will create a new instance of our Game1 class and then run it. Okay? But notice it throws some errors. It says Game1 could not be found. That's because we haven't made that class yet. So let's go back, right-click Game Engine, add class, and let's call this one game1.cs. Make sure it's spelled with a capital G. That's important that it's spelled correctly. Add. And here we can go back to the Michael Hicks toolbox, and the Game1 class skeleton file has a Game1 class that we can Control-A, Control-C to copy all of it. And returning here, we can replace the stub that Visual Studio has provided and hit Control-V to paste ours. I will explain this code in just a second. Notice that there's some red lines underneath various things. Sprite Batch and Graphics Device Manager, these are classes that FNA has provided for us, but it's throwing a red line saying that we can't find them, and that's because we're not telling Visual Studio that we want to use the FNA library in this specific class. And up here we have the using statements, and the using statements are how we tell Visual Studio what libraries that other people have written that we want to use here. So let's go back to the Michael Hicks toolbox, and I have another one here called Game1 Using Statements. You can copy all of that and then replace it and paste up here, and all the errors go away and we're good to go. Notice that it says we're using Microsoft.xna.framework stuff. And remember earlier I said FNA is a recreation of XNA. And since a lot of people were coming from XNA 4 games that were programmed like this, FNA was cool enough to just keep these using names the same as before, so we didn't have to go and change everything and retype using FNA.framework. We can just use these or keep them the same without any changes. So at this point, we should be able to press F5 and we should be able to see a game window come up. Fingers crossed. Let's see what happens. Yeah, check that out, baby. Cornflower blue. And people who come from XNA4 backgrounds, this is like a tradition in programming these types of games, right? We have this awesome cornflower blue game screen, and this is our game window, people. Man, this is awesome. This is where all of the graphics for our game will be displayed. Our entire game will be drawn in this window. And what's cool about this is FNA is handling all of this stuff under the hood, okay? FNA is creating this game window, and FNA is taking care of all these kind of graphical things for us, so we don't have to worry about it. So let's go ahead and exit out. And for people who are unfamiliar with how XNA or FNA games are set up, I'm going to give you a quick overview of what all is in our game1.cs class. So at the top here, we have two variables. The first one is the graphics device manager graphics, and this basically gives us access to the graphics device in the computer that we're running this game on. We can see things such as the resolutions that are capable on this computer. Some computers might only be able to run 1280 by 720 resolution. Some computers can draw the game at a higher resolution, right? All the info is stored in here. Next, we have a Sprite Batch variable, and this is basically the bread and butter of all 2D games in FNA. Think of it as putting in a batch of cookies to bake. You have 30 or however many cookies on a sheet, and they all bake at the same time. It's more efficient to bake all those cookies on one sheet than to cook each cookie at a time, right? No one puts one cookie in an oven at a time, 60 times. No one does that. It's not efficient. Sprite Batch will take all of the different sprites we want to draw in our game, and a sprite would be things like our character or power-up, any type of graphical element in our game. We will queue up all of these graphics into one Sprite Batch and then call spritebatch.draw, and Sprite Batch will draw all of these things in one iteration. Okay? So that's very useful, very efficient, and we'll be using that a lot in the next video. Next, we have the game1.cs constructor, and this is created whenever the game1 class is initially created in the program.cs function that we made earlier. And basically just this does a few setting up a few variables here. It sets up the graphics device manager, and it also sets up the root directory for our content manager. And the content manager is used to load any assets in our game. So if we want to load some audio, play some songs, if we want to load an image to draw to the screen, we would load all of those things through the content manager. Next, we have the Initialize function, and this is used to initialize any type of non-graphic variables. So if you have some ints or some strings or data variables that you want to initialize, this is the place to do it. Next, we have the load content function, and this is where you would load graphical things or other game assets like audio. Notice that we have our Sprite Batch being created here because it's a graphic related variable. And then finally, we have the two most important functions in the whole game. We have our update function and our draw function. And each one of these functions are called every frame. Our games will usually run at 60 frames per second. So each frame will call update and update all of our game logic. This is where we would see if the player is moving, detect input from the controller or the keyboard and move our people around. This is where we would play sound effects, check for collision detections, if the player has ran into a wall and needs to stop moving, things like that. And then after that, we would call the draw function, and this would draw everything to the screen. Notice we have a few things in these functions already. The base.update and the base.draw functions are calling things FNA is doing under the hood. So under the hood, FNA is updating some logic and drawing some things to the screen. So we don't need to worry about that, but we do need to call these functions to make sure FNA is doing everything that it needs to do. Here we're calling graphicsDevice.clear, and remember that cornflower blue color I showed you earlier on the window? It's being cleared here. So if you want to see a different color on the screen, you could say color.black or color.green. There's many different colors here you can choose from. Feel free to experiment with that if you'd like. I'm going to keep mine on cornflower blue. And we want to clear the screen each frame, because if we don't do that, graphical elements will start to blur together, right? So say you're moving as the player, and you have a little guy on the screen here. If you do not clear the screen and you move to the right, you're going to see a bunch of, you'll see 20 different copies, basically, of that same player in every position that he's been at to move to the right, okay? But luckily, if we clear the screen, we can clear out all the old things that we've drawn to the screen and only show the newest, most up-to-date thing we want to draw, okay? And that's basically the gist of it. This is the core skeleton of our game engine, and in the next video, we will begin loading in some graphical elements and drawing some things to the screen, and maybe even moving around a little bit. So I'm sure you don't want to miss that. Thank you for watching this video. I hope it was helpful, and I hope to see you all on the next video.